You know, I feel like we have this deeply ingrained habit of treating our eyes like biological cameras. And by extension, our minds, really. You just
Yeah.
open your eyes, the shutter clicks, and you capture the facts of the world exactly as they are.
Yeah, it implies this really clean, objective, binary relationship with reality, which is a very comforting thought, honestly.
Right, it is. It's safe. But okay, let's unpack this because today, our mission in this deep dive is to explore a profoundly disorienting question. What if that camera model is entirely backward? What if we don't snap photos of reality, but instead we are actually forced to read it?
Like a complex text,
Yeah,
forced to interpret it and translate it in real time.
exactly. So for you listening right now, the goal today is to see how abandoning that camera metaphor changes, well, pretty much everything about how you interact with the world, from your personal relationships all the way to like your understanding of the cosmos. And we are pulling this from a stack of sources surrounding a groundbreaking 2026 book called The Conflict of Interpretations, Paul Ricœur and the Self as Another.
Right, by the philosopher Boris Kriger. And Kriger is pulling off a really fascinating intellectual maneuver here. I mean, we are probably already familiar with Paul Ricœur. He was the 20th century philosopher who applied hermeneutics, the theory of interpretation, to texts and human existence.
Mostly in the humanities, right?
Exactly. But Krieger's original contribution here is that he takes Ricœur's philosophy entirely out of the humanities seminar room. He just lifts it up and fuses it directly with the hard sciences.
Which is wild. We are talking systems theory, cognitive science, quantum physics, and cosmology. Kriger is basically arguing that this conflict of interpretations isn't just, a soft skill for analyzing literature.
No, not at all. He makes the case that interpretation is a structural necessity of reality itself. It's baked into the universe wherever there is sufficient complexity.
Okay, but to grasp how that applies to subatomic particles, the whole universe, I think we first need to strip away our assumptions about how we process just, like, everyday human reality.
Oh, for sure. We operate with such speed day to day that we mistake our own rapid-fire interpretations for raw, unmediated facts.
Right. Think about the physical sensation of stepping off a train in a foreign city where you don't speak a single word of the language. For a few disorienting minutes, you experience something adults almost never encounter.
A world that hasn't been read yet.
Yes, the signage above the platform is just a geometric arrangement of unfamiliar shapes. The announcements echoing over the loudspeaker wash over you as pure acoustic phenomena. It's just melody without semantic weight.
It is raw data, completely devoid of significance. You are experiencing the signal before the interpretive act, but notice how quickly your brain scrambles to fix that.
It hates the vacuum.
It really does. You scan the chaos until your eye catches a stylized figure climbing stairs, or maybe just an arrow pointing toward a door. Instantly, meaning floods back in. You haven't changed the physical environment at all, but you recognize the symbol, and suddenly you are reading the city.
And the strangeness just dissolves. Within an hour, you move through that environment transparently. I was actually thinking about how this maps onto our digital lives, too. Imagine reading a text message from your partner after a tense morning, and it just says one word: fine.
Oh yeah, that is a heavy word.
Right. The meaning of that text is obviously not located in the physics of the pixels on the screen, and it's definitely not the dictionary definition of the word. The meaning lives entirely in the architecture of your relationship, the historical context or previous arguments, and your specific interpretive act in that exact moment.
What's fascinating here is that this interpretive engine, it never shuts off. Even when language is entirely absent.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, you wake up, you observe a specific shade of gray in the clouds, and you reach for an umbrella. Or you read the posture of a stranger walking toward you on an empty street. Or even just a sudden drop in volume in a crowded room. You're reading all of that. The ancient Greeks actually had an incredibly robust intuition about this dynamic. They captured it in the concept of logos.
Logos. Yeah, that usually gets translated as speech or reason or the underlying order of things, right?
It encompasses all of those, yeah.
Yeah.
Because they recognize that intelligibility isn't something we violently impose on a mute, passive reality. Nor is it something the universe just hands to us fully formed.
It's more like a collision.
Exactly. It emerges organically in the encounter between a signal and an interpreter, meaning it's a relational property. It lives in the active space between the observer and the observed. It's not locked within the signal itself.
Okay, but if meaning lives in that relational space, in the active interpretation itself, we run into an immediate problem. What happens when the surface meaning of a signal is actively deceptive?
Ah, yes. the masters of suspicion.
Right. Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, they completely dismantled that dominant tradition of taking things at face value. I mean, Freud showed us that orderly conscious thoughts often disguise this turbulent underworld of forbidden desire. A slip of the tongue isn't an accident.
No, it's a structural leak of a hidden wish.
Exactly. And then Marx applied that same unmasking to the sociological level. He argued that society's cherished universal truths are frequently just ideological disguises for the material interests of the ruling class.
Right, you don't read a society by looking at its noble legal documents. You interpret it by exposing the economic scaffolding underneath.
And Nietzsche took a hammer to morality itself. He argued our highest virtues are often just the historical residue of ancient power struggles, weapons of the weak or the confidence of the strong. They basically broke the first naivety. Sincerity became no guarantee of truth.
It's a very destabilizing realization.
It is. And I have to push back a bit on relying too heavily on this framework, because if we apply that suspicion universally, if every single motive is secretly selfish or just a cynical play for power, society basically collapses into a hall of mirrors.
It does.
If you unmask everything, eventually you have nothing left to look at but masks. It just spirals into a paralyzing, toxic cynicism where we can't believe anything anyone says.
That is the fatal flaw of unchecked suspicion. And Ricœur completely validates that anxiety. Suspicion, if pressed to its absolute logical limit, just consumes itself.
It eats its own tail.
Right. If your only cognitive tool is a hammer designed to shatter illusions, you lose the capacity to be addressed by anything genuine. You can never be moved, never be taught, never experience solidarity. Ricœur realized that total unrelenting suspicion is just as catastrophic a failure as total gullible naivety.
But we obviously can't go back to being gullible, right? We can't unlearn what psychology and sociology have taught us. So how do we escape the hall of mirrors?
Through what Ricœur termed the second naivety. The goal isn't to retreat from suspicion and fear, but to pass completely through it, to arrive at a chastened, mature trust on the other side.
Okay, I love the example of the veteran music critic for this. Imagine someone who has spent 30 years rigorously exposing the manipulative architecture of modern composition. He knows exactly how the calculated key changes work.
He recognizes the formulaic chord progressions.
Yes. The specific frequency swells engineered in a studio just to extract a physiological tear response from an audience. He is the ultimate master of suspicion in the concert hall. He knows exactly how the sausage is made.
So he cannot be tricked by the surface-level emotional play.
Exactly. But then he sits in the auditorium, the orchestra plays, and despite all his rigorous, cynical knowledge, he finds himself weeping. He sees completely through the manipulation, he registers every calculated flaw in the composition, but he allows himself to be moved by the beauty of the performance anyway.
That is so powerful.
It is. He doesn't abandon his critical faculties, he integrates them. He passes through the suspicion and chooses to trust the aesthetic experience regardless.
And that perfectly embodies the mechanics of the second naivety. It is the conscious choice to suspect without succumbing to nihilism, and to trust without lapsing back into credulity, which, honestly, requires a tremendous amount of intellectual and emotional stamina.
It really does. And here's where it gets really interesting. Let's say we develop that stamina. We achieve this mature second naivety. How do we apply that when we run into a complex text or an event that supports multiple, completely incompatible yet entirely valid interpretations?
Right, because the world is rarely just one thing.
Exactly. Let's take a famously dense 5-word sentence. The truth will set you free. If you put that sentence in front of a room of highly educated, thoughtful people, you will generate at least 4 completely distinct frameworks of meaning.
Easily. I mean, the psychological reading frames it around internal congruence. To be free is to face reality, to end the exhausting cognitive labor of maintaining a state of denial.
Or a behavioral addiction, yeah. Then the emancipatory reading approaches it through the lens of power dynamics. Knowledge is literal leverage. Grasping the hidden mechanics of an unjust system gives marginalized groups the tactical power to break the chains of their oppressors.
True. And then the philosophical reading interprets it as an existential mandate to live an authentic life, stripping away societal pretense.
And finally, the suspicious reading, informed by Nietzsche, demands to know who is claiming to possess the truth and how they are weaponizing that claim to enforce compliance. Freedom on whose terms, you know.
All 4 readings are derived from the exact same 5 words, and arguably none of them are incorrect.
Right. This requires a shift in how we think about information. A text is not a bucket of water that you just pour a fixed, objective volume of meaning out of. Boris Kriger utilizes this brilliant biological metaphor for this. He says a text is leaven. It's yeast mixed into dough.
Which is a highly reactive chemical process. Yeast doesn't simply sit inertly in a bowl. It requires a specific biochemical environment to activate.
Exactly. It needs the specific proteins and sugars present in the flour to metabolize, create gas, and cause the bread to rise. In this metaphor, the text is the yeast, but the reader is the flour.
Oh, I like that.
Right. The text leavens differently depending on the specific life experiences, the historical trauma, and the intellectual framework the reader brings to the encounter. The meaning is generated in the chemical reaction between the two.
But we must tread very carefully here, because that metaphor can easily slide into absolute relativism. If meaning is entirely dependent on the reader's flour, does that mean any interpretation is equally valid?
Oh, definitely not.
Right, Kriger vigorously rejects that. He introduces the concept of bounded multiplicity. If you read the phrase, "the truth will set you free," and claim it is secretly a coded recipe for making sourdough bread, you haven't tapped into a profound surplus of meaning. You have simply hallucinated.
You've just imposed your own arbitrary fantasy onto the text.
Exactly.
So we have to establish guardrails. How do we prevent bounded multiplicity from devolving into this chaotic, anything-goes relativism?
We apply 3 rigorous diagnostic tests to any interpretation. First, is the reading supported by tangible evidence within the structure of the text itself? Second, is it plausible? Like, does it cohere logically with the broader context of what else we know to be true about the author or the historical period?
And the third one.
Third, and perhaps most importantly, is it fruitful?
Does it act as an intellectual catalyst? Like, does it open the text up, generating deeper questions and a richer understanding? Or does it just shut the conversation down into a flat, dogmatic dead end?
Right. So, bounded multiplicity allows for a wide spectrum of valid readings, but it decisively proves that not all readings are valid.
This is such a critical threshold in Kriger's 2026 book. He takes this concept of bounded multiplicity, the necessity of holding multiple, valid, sometimes incompatible interpretations, and he maps it directly onto the hard sciences.
Yes, this is where he makes the leap.
This blew the doors open for me. We assume interpretation is just a quirk of human culture, but Kriger uses his background in systems theory to demonstrate that interpretation is the fundamental mechanical operation of the human brain. Think about the physiological mechanics of vision. We say we see the world, but the brain itself sits in absolute darkness, locked inside a bone vault.
That has no direct access to light or trees or the sky.
Exactly. It is exclusively receiving a barrage of coded, ambiguous electrical impulses traveling along the optic nerve. The brain must rapidly construct a coherent, full-color, three-dimensional model of the world based entirely on incomplete data. It doesn't perceive reality, it interprets electrical syntax, and projects a semantic model.
Which is precisely why optical illusions are so effective. The physical image on paper doesn't change, but your brain's interpretive software gets caught in the loop. It misreads the depth cues or the shading.
The brain is predicting and interpreting before you ever consciously perceive. But Kriger scales this up dramatically into quantum physics. The wave-particle duality of light is the ultimate scientific manifestation of bounded multiplicity.
It really is. At the subatomic level, an electron exhibits the properties of a continuous wave, spreading out and interfering with itself. But under different experimental conditions, it behaves as a discrete, localized particle. These are 2 mutually exclusive physical descriptions.
Mechanically, they cannot be reconciled into a single, neat conceptual model.
No, they can't. The universe isn't just wishing costumes. The interpretive frameworks we build, the physical experiments we design, literally demand incompatible languages to describe a single, unified reality. Physicists are forced to hold 2 conflicting interpretations simultaneously because neither one alone can capture the full truth of the system.
And then Kriger pushes this to its absolute limit with cosmology, which is just mind-bending. When astrophysicists attempt to model the origins and structure of the entire universe, they run into a terminal epistemological wall, because we are forced to read the universe from inside the universe.
Right, you can't step outside of it.
Kriger's analogy for this is stunning. He says it is like trying to comprehend the plot of an entire novel when you are just a single letter printed on one of the pages.
That is so humbling. You are entangled with the observed system. You can never step outside the universe to achieve an objective, God's eye view. You can never check your local mathematical interpretation against the definitive, real thing because there is no external vantage point.
We only have access to our local, fragmented sliver of evidence, and we must infer the vast, unobservable whole.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, and synthesize all of this, the optic nerve, quantum mechanics, cosmology, we arrive at Kriger's unified structural theory. Any sufficiently complex reality, whether it's the psychological identity of a human being, the behavior of a photon, or the expansion of the cosmos, inherently requires multiple, incompatible descriptions to be understood.
The conflict of interpretations isn't a symptom of human ignorance. It is a rigorous, mathematical feature of the universe.
It fundamentally redefines our relationship with truth, meaning does not exist in a state of static rest. It lives in perpetual tension.
But, we have to address the immediate terrifying reality of living with this knowledge. Because if epistemological uncertainty and multiple truths are woven into the fabric of the universe, how do we protect ourselves? We are currently living through an era where bad actors actively weaponize this exact philosophical concept to manipulate global populations.
You are referring to the deliberate engineering of post-truth paralysis.
Exactly. Look at a modern digital newsroom. Journalists receive a video of a head of state declaring war or confessing to a crime. Within seconds, it is being broadcast to millions of cell phones. The newsroom has minutes to determine if this is actual documentary footage or a highly sophisticated AI-generated deepfake.
And the architects of those disinformation campaigns, they understand the mechanics of bounded multiplicity perfectly.
Yeah.
Their goal is rarely to convince you of a specific alternate lie.
No, it's about flooding the zone.
Exactly. They flood the information ecosystem with so many conflicting high-quality interpretations of an event that the public's cognitive capacity is just overwhelmed. They weaponize the inherent difficulty of interpretation to induce apathy.
They want the public to conclude that because everything is subject to interpretation, nothing can be verified, and therefore objective reality is a myth.
They use the existence of the Hall of Mirrors to convince us that the outside world doesn't exist at all.
So how does a newsroom, or how do we as individuals fight back against that paralysis?
By applying those exact same rigorous tests of interpretation we discussed earlier, just adapted for the digital environment. We don't surrender to relativism. We check for corroboration. We aggressively trace the provenance of the digital file.
We analyze consistency, right? Does the lighting and audio artifacting cohere with the known physics of the environment?
Yes. We hold two seemingly contradictory truths in our minds at once. Yes, all human understanding is fundamentally an act of interpretation, and simultaneous to that, interpretations can still be ruthlessly and rigorously judged against physical evidence.
Just because we don't possess a flawless objective camera lens doesn't mean we are incapable of distinguishing a heavily manipulated deepfake from an actual historical event.
It requires vigilance, though. We must acknowledge our epistemological limits without using them as an excuse for intellectual cowardice.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this right now, trying to navigate an increasingly complex and deceptive reality?
It directs us toward the ultimate ambition of both Ricœur's and Kriger's work, which is the cultivation of wisdom. In this framework, wisdom is not defined as accumulating a massive database of final, unassailable facts.
What is it then?
Wisdom is the psychological and intellectual capacity to hold the agonizing tension of incompatible interpretations without collapsing.
Without retreating into the false comfort of dogmatic certainty, where you just cross your arms and say, my reading of this text or this data is the only possible reading.
Precisely. And equally, without surrendering to cynical despair, where you throw your hands up and say, it's all manipulated, nothing matters. Truth is a fiction. Wisdom is the endurance required to stand in that demanding, turbulent middle ground. Kriger shows us that conflict is the inescapable destiny of conscious thought.
And recognizing that is the first step toward genuine understanding. We have covered an immense amount of intellectual territory today. I mean, we started by stripping away the camera metaphor and standing disoriented in a foreign train station. We examined the masters of suspicion and the profound difficulty of achieving a mature second naivety.
We traced bounded multiplicity from the yeast in a ball of dough all the way down to the wave-particle duality of subatomic physics.
And we confronted the weaponization of interpretation in the era of digital deepfakes. It all converges on a single inescapable reality. To be conscious is to be condemned to interpret. There is no opting out of the hermeneutic circle.
This raises an important question, though, especially as we look to the future. The sources touch briefly on the explosion of artificial intelligence. We're currently building sprawling neural networks, automated filters, and large language models that classify, moderate, and generate human language at an unprecedented scale.
Right.
These systems process the syntactic form of our symbols with terrifying efficiency, but they possess zero semantic grounding. They do not possess the lived physical, biological experience the flower, in our earlier metaphor, required to actually understand the human world. They map statistical relationships between words, but they do not experience meaning.
So, as we increasingly outsource our cultural memory, our legal moderation, and our daily interpretations of reality to these machines, are we quietly outsourcing our most fundamental human trait? If the conflict of interpretations is the very destiny of thought, what happens to humanity when we hand the responsibility of that conflict over to an algorithm that can only perceive mathematical patterns but is entirely blind to significance?
It's a sobering thought.
That is definitely something to keep you up at night. Today, I challenge you to actively embrace the tension of your own interpretations. Don't run from the conflict and refuse the comfort of easy, singular answers. Remember, your mind is not a passive camera snapping pictures in the dark. You are reading the world. Keep turning the pages and keep reading responsibly.